Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. It's my pleasure to introduce William Thomas Field-Papuga to you, who is our youngest, I think, team member at the department, which is great because that brings us into the position to restart an old series in our Boni again. As some of you might remember, we started this series in April 2020 by inviting fellow colleagues from the department to tell us about the situation in their home country. And that's what we are going to do today, because William is from Australia, and that brings us into the position to learn a little bit more from someone who really knows about the country, because he comes from the country, about the situation in Australia. William, just to introduce him very briefly, graduated with a Bachelor of Law and a Bachelor of Arts at Monash University in Melbourne in Australia. He undertook extensive work within community legal services and non-governmental organizations, and then completed a Master of Laws in Public International Law at the University of Vienna. This is the reason why he made his way to Europe and to Austria and Vienna in particular. And he was very successful in this master program, which then led to the situation that he worked in different positions, in particular for the United Nations, for the International Atomic Energy Agency, the International Law Commission, and finally with us at the Department of Innovation and Digitalization in Law, where William is responsible for a very, very interesting and challenging project funded by the Austrian National Bank, the ÖNB, Österreichische Nationalbank. And the project is about platform liability and platforms in the information society as a whole. And William is leading this, and with his very international and public international background, I'm very excited to work with him on this. And I'm even more excited today probably to learn more about Australia. Thank you, William, for being with us. Let me perhaps ask a very, very fundamental question at the very beginning. Perhaps you could tell us about the inner organization of Australia in this crisis in particular, and in how far the different regions play a different role in this, and the relationship between the federal state and the different regions. And then from this starting point, we will then certainly go a little bit more into detail about the differences and the things that are in common in the different areas. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Certainly. Thanks, Nicholas, and thank you very much for your kind welcome. Yes, certainly. So this is quite a sort of complex and intricate relationship that the states have with the federal government in Australia, but just very briefly, so there are 6 states in Australia, and Australia follows a federal style of government, much like Austria. Mm-hmm. And so in this the COVID crisis, it really I think brought to the fore the very interesting relationship that states have with the federal government. So what you had is really state governments really taking the lead on the lockdowns to sort of bring the COVID numbers under control in their own states, locking down certain regions and such, and really taking a sort of micromanagement approach to the situation. You had quite a wide variety of approaches taken. So for instance, in a state like Victoria, which is where I'm from, the approach was very strict. It was one of sort of going for 0 COVID numbers as soon as any sort of large outbreak was sort of emerging, and this approach was taken to different extents by the other states. So a state like Western Australia, which is the biggest state, also took a similar approach where they would completely lock down their borders to certain states where even after perhaps the recording of a couple of cases, they would lock down the borders to people entering from that state, and they would only let people in provided they had certain exceptions. And so above all of this, you have the federal government, which is responsible for, I guess, the more sort of coordinating within the Department of Health, and also managing things like repatriating Australians who have been essentially stranded overseas during the crisis. But even in this respect, states have also sort of taken a quite a leading role, because they essentially allocate how many Australians from overseas can be repatriated to that state in particular, in order so that the lockdown, or the quarantine hotels aren't overwhelmed with excessive cases that are not manageable. So I guess that's a sort of very brief overview of the relationship between the federal government and the states. It's obviously complicated by a few sort of just, I guess, natural sort of sticking points with politics, because the federal government at the moment is a liberal government. This is sort of the equivalent of perhaps the ÖVP in Austria, sort of centre-right party, whereas many of the states are represented by the Labour Party, which is a centre-left party. So there's been a lot of tension at times over the certain approaches taken by state governments that were on the Labour side, as opposed to the Liberal side, which is somewhat controversial, but unfortunately a little bit inevitable.
Yeah, I see. But when you come to the federal level, when at the moment, at least if I understand it correctly, there is more or less a zero COVID policy happening there at the moment, right? So this is the official goal that is.
Indeed, yeah. Yes. So they've essentially, so in their stages of reopening, I believe there are 3 stages. They're currently in the COVID safe, is what it's called, the COVID safe stage, which essentially is the last step before complete reopening of everything, and essentially life goes back to normal. So this stage is quite there's quite light restrictions relative to the other stages, and they also have, like in Austria, they've instituted a sort of traffic light system, just indicating which areas are at more risk regarding high numbers of cases and such. But currently, I believe that the entire country is in green, so they're in obviously a very, very fortunate position.
Yeah, but that's possible because they are taking very, very strict measures, in particular when people want to come to the country, right? Even Australians can't freely enter the country at the moment, can they? So could you go home simply at the moment?
No, unfortunately, this is definitely, whilst the situation might be very positive at home, definitely the obvious big losers from the whole situation are Australians who are abroad. And I believe the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has set up a sort of server to basically where Australians are abroad who are in dire need of coming home can register themselves. So these are people who perhaps they don't have a visa for the country that they're currently in, they don't have a job, they don't have any sort of means of really supporting themselves, can register themselves. And I believe at last count it was over 35,000 Australians who are in this sort of dire need, really need to get back. But unfortunately, just due to the allowance on the cap, as it's called, of people who are allowed to come back to the country, which currently is around 2,000 per week, so very small relative to the amount of demand. The cap also sort of linked with commercial realities of, these big airlines doing long-haul flights with half-empty planes. This is obviously a very tough situation. Flights can be very hard to come by and very expensive when they are available, because the airlines fill the airplane from the front to the back in order to make the flight economically viable for them, which means obviously selling the first class and business class tickets first. So unfortunately, it's not uncommon. I believe I saw just a flight from Los Angeles to Brisbane that was selling for, I believe, something like 21,000 Australian dollars. It's roughly sort of 14,000 thereabouts euros. So incredibly expensive. It's a business class ticket, obviously, but incredibly expensive and definitely extremely unusual. So yeah, but this is sort of a part of what has been kind of called the 4 pillars to Australia's success. So on the one hand, there's strict lockdown as far as the country goes, as far as letting people into the country, international arrivals. But then there's also other pillars such as contact tracing, strict lockdowns, and also quite a compliant population. A lot of people really sort of took it upon themselves to abide by the rules. So yeah, I believe these are what's commonly cited as part of the success in Australia's situation.
Yeah, and are these caps challenged legally or politically or both, or is it simply accepted as something that needs to be done?
Yeah, I think that, well, I guess more, so I'm actually personally not aware of any legal challenges to the caps. They do vary a lot depending on the circumstances. So just after New Year's, for instance, the caps were halved because of the emergence of variants in Europe. And in Victoria's case, which just recently, within the last sort of fortnight, has gone through a snap lockdown, which was just a 5-day very strict lockdown. They subsequently even lowered still their cap to, I believe, only a couple of hundred people allowed into the country per week, which is obviously extremely slow. It's extremely small. But as far as like politically challenging these goes, it is quite difficult. I have, I mean, on the one hand, like the people who this measure affects are, it's kind of convenient for, I guess, from a political standpoint, because the people who it affects are people who are not in the country at the moment, and sort of, whereas people within the country are very, interested in maintaining the sort of status quo of low cases and not exposing states to another lockdown and such. So whilst these caps are like very unpopular for people outside the country, they're quite popular for people inside. Yeah, I have heard though of certain individuals who are overseas lobbying their members of parliament, and these have actually been successful in sort of expediting their, if they need to purchase a ticket because they're in dire need, this has sometimes worked. But otherwise, the government has also, I believe, recently instituted a loan-free scheme where essentially people who are in economic hardship abroad can apply for interest-free loans from the federal government. So there is this level of support, but unfortunately, it is still a tricky situation.
Yeah, but and is there any plan how long this situation can continue as it is? Because I would assume that locking down a whole continent for such for I don't know, unlimited time might have quite significant impact on the economical situation, but also on the social situation inside and outside the country for citizens of the country. Is there any midterm to long-term perspective in this, or is it just that this is seen as a success and therefore it's the path to follow at the moment, and let's debate other things later?
Yeah, I believe that it is perceived that this is a successful model, and this is what they're going for at the moment. So for the foreseeable future, I believe that from one report that I read, they're not planning on completely reopening Australia to international travel for the rest of the calendar year. So
the
this
rest of the year. Wow.
Yeah. So
wow.
It's not necessarily the official policy, but it's strongly suggested so. Unless anything changes. But so Australia, I guess, unlike other countries, is also only now vaccinating its population. So there is a certain lag in that respect, that they're going to sort of obviously take their time to vaccinate as many people as need to be vaccinated first, until exposing, I guess, this additional risk.
Yeah, and vaccination was not one of the 4 pillars that you mentioned before, right? So it's something to add to the 4 pillars, but the 4 were this control when people enter the country. Then it was lockdowns, tracing, and compliance, right? So
yeah, indeed. So I believe that if not this week, then in the next 1 or 2 weeks, Australia will actually start the vaccination program, and this will be with the Pfizer vaccine, I believe. And actually what makes Australia somewhat unique in this respect is that the regulatory process was actually conducted by a normal process for vaccines, which means that it sort of took the amount of time as would normally be taken for a vaccine where there is no pandemic and there's no urgency. So there weren't any emergency protocols invoked to do so. But yes.
And is it easier for Australians who are vaccinated and are outside the country to re-enter Australia, or is there no difference made so far?
So far, there's no difference. I believe that what's cited is that it's still uncertain to what degree the vaccine prevents transmission. But I think this could be an area that changes quite rapidly in the very near future.
Because this is, as you certainly know, one of the hot topics here in Europe at the moment, whether it's legally justifiable to draw distinctions between people who are vaccinated and those who are not. But that would not be really a matter of concern in Australia, or would it be?
Not at this stage. I think it's not really part of the public discourse, just at the minute. But I could see it being part of it in the next few months, perhaps.
Yeah,
as the vaccine rollout really picks up steam, so to speak.
Yeah. When it comes to the lockdowns, William, as far as I know, they are very, very rigid. And although there are just very few cases, right? So whenever there is a case, more or less, there is a lockdown, right? First, is this true? And second, is this, is this challenged from a legal or a political or an economical perspective? Because the impact of this must be rather significant, obviously.
Sure. Yeah. No. Really great question. We'll try and break it down into sort of into parts. But so certainly in the case of Victoria, for instance, Melbourne and the rest of Victoria went through, I believe, one of the harshest lockdowns that was implemented in the world. So what this was actually in response to a second wave in Melbourne. So this started because of essentially the virus getting out through a hotel quarantine for international travelers coming back to Melbourne. And this was actually responsible for, I believe, around sort of 25,000 of the 30,000 total COVID cases that have been recorded in Australia since the pandemic. So this was really, I guess, the epicenter of the vaccine outbreak in Australia. But the measures were extremely harsh, certainly at first. So initially, it was people had to wear masks when they left the house. That's when they were given a 5-kilometer radius from their house that they could freely move within, but they had to essentially have a excuse to leave the house. And things that weren't excuses were actually, so if you wanted to visit a relative or a loved one, these were not excuses. You couldn't do this originally. And so, yes, extremely harsh. And also a curfew came into effect, I believe, around 8 p.m. So people had to be back home by that time. And again, not many exceptions were permitted as far as that that curfew was concerned. And in addition to this, it was just a very long period as well. It was 111 days, and obviously, like, cases were not particularly high a lot of the time, but the goal was, I believe, to get the case number within 5 people per day, or even less. And so often the case numbers were only sort of low double digits, sort of in the 20s, perhaps even lower, but the lockdown sort of persisted. So yeah, extremely tough measures at the start. And as far as sort of challenges go, so from an economic perspective, it's kind of interesting because during the lockdown, there was the perception that this was going to be a massive economic hit for the state of Victoria and Melbourne, which is Australia's second biggest city. And there was a degree of pressure from the federal government to ease the really harsh restrictions that were placed on Victorians. And part of this was, and I should also mention that people from regional Victoria were not able to enter Melbourne, and people from Melbourne were not able to enter regional Victoria. But so in this time, the federal government was pressuring a sort of easing of the lockdown. And this is in part because they funded this JobKeeper allowance, which is a wage subsidy for employers. And so obviously at this time, a lot of money was being funded to Victorian businesses to stay afloat. But actually, interestingly enough, from the economic perspective, apparently, from what I've heard, the amount of, now that Victoria and Australia is out of lockdown, the amount of insolvencies is actually 60% lower than it was before the pandemic. And so this sort of wave of insolvencies that was sort of foreseen didn't end up actually materializing. And one of the theories is that essentially there are a lot of these so-called zombie businesses essentially operating that would have, under normal circumstances, because of market competition and such, they would have simply gone out of business and gone into liquidation. Because of the JobKeeper, they've essentially been sort of artificially sort of kept afloat. And so economically, from this standpoint, Australia is doing and Victoria is doing fairly well. They're set to make up the GDP that was lost last year, which is obviously quite interesting. Yeah. And of course, I can go into legal challenges as well.
Please,
if you would like.
Yes. Please.
So there was quite a prominent legal challenge to the Victorian lockdown, specifically on this 5-kilometre radius rule that was brought in. And this actually went all the way to the High Court. This was because the plaintiff in this case, who was a hotel owner in Sorrento. Sorrento is quite a nice sort of beach resort town that's very close to Melbourne. Essentially, his business had really suffered as a result of this 5-kilometre radius and the restrictions to movement, because obviously people from Melbourne couldn't come to Sorrento and frequent his pub. And what he was challenging was a sort of constitutional right to movement, right to freedom of movement, which I believe is sort of become quite controversial in countries like the Netherlands. But interestingly, in Australia's case, because there were so few actual rights that are written into the Constitution, there's only really 4 explicit rights, which have to do with right to trial by jury and freedom of religion and such. he based his claim on what he labeled as an implied freedom of movement. And this was quite interesting, because this was more or less completely uncharted constitutional territory. And so the states were extremely sort of anxious to assist Victoria in sort of suppressing this challenge, because it would have essentially undermined all sort of responses to the virus that restricted people's movement. And the sort of arguments that surrounded this was that, all right, so in Australia we have an implied freedom of political communication. So this is not written in the Constitution, but it is firmly established by the case law, the common law, that Australia is a representative democracy, it's a federation, and so it needs, therefore, freedom of political communication. And then the plaintiff's argument to this was ancillary to a freedom of political communication is a freedom of movement. You have to be moving freely in order to exercise properly this well-established freedom of communication, political communication. And not only that, he says that Australia is a federation, and because it's a federation, then there has to be freedom of movement between the states. That this was a sort of necessary conclusion when they wrote the Constitution. And so, yeah, essentially the High Court was sort of placed in a very, very tight position, where essentially if they agreed with the plaintiff, they would be establishing a right that hadn't been established before, and not only that, they'd be making it right in the middle of a global pandemic. So there was a lot of pressure, I guess, from their perspective, but the long and the short was that the claim was actually unsuccessful, and it was sort of deemed that in this circumstance that federation means what federation in the Constitution, the meaning that it's given in the Constitution. So it's not, these sort of broad concepts of, what a federation is, perhaps in America or in Austria and such. It's what is it written in the Constitution. And then furthermore, on this point of political communication, there's a big question over whether, because someone is restricted in terms of their freedom of movement to a 5-kilometer radius, their political communication is necessarily impacted by this. And furthermore, because he was a pub operator, it's not necessarily the link to political communication that would have perhaps made this case more successful. And so, reading a lot of legal scholars' opinions on this, the outcome was actually a resounding no from the High Court. Unanimously, all the judges who were presiding ruled against it. A very short ruling, which is quite uncommon. Rulings tend to be quite long in Australia. And in the process, this is essentially perhaps put an end to this discussion of some sort of absolute right to freedom in the Australian freedom of movement in the Australian Constitution, which is quite an interesting outcome. Although there is some discussion that, perhaps if he hadn't have been a pub operator, but he was a federal politician and he wasn't able to get back to Canberra to participate in a debate or something, that this would have perhaps created a right to freedom of movement, but in very strict circumstances where, it's someone that really needs to be somewhere to represent their constituents or something like this. So that was just an interesting case, but one of
very
not
interesting. Yeah, and was it important that this happened during a pandemic? So was the pandemic a legal argument in the debate, that it might be useful from a pandemic point of view to restrict freedom of movement, and that it's some kind of an outstanding situation, and that therefore the legal answer might differ under normal circumstances? Or was this not really?
Actually, interestingly enough, the court's decision was very constitutionally focused. There wasn't too much emphasis actually placed on the facts themselves. They were really kind of analyzing the constitutional arguments. But there was like a sort of parallel case that was actually heard in the same week by the High Court challenging the Western Australian approach, because Clive Palmer was the plaintiff in this case. Is quite a well-known, very colourful politician, was trying to get into Western Australia, and he was not given an exemption to do so. And so he actually pointed to one of the explicit rights in the Constitution, which is the freedom of intercourse between the states, or the freedom of movement between the states. But even in this case, the High Court was more discussing the facts. They said that, look, this intercourse between the states is not an absolute right. There are many cases in the past where, you know, certain states had perhaps a biohazard. Something that's quite common is if there's a sort of a fruit fly or something that gets onto fruits that could infect, you know, farms in other states, that state is then sort of cordoned off and quarantined. So this is quite a normal thing, and it's it doesn't necessarily give rise to any constitutional objection. So in his case, that was also unsuccessful, and they also focused a bit more on the factual circumstances of there being a global pandemic.
And is there any social/political reaction to this? So, I mean, in Europe, for example, we are confronted with, and somebody's even asking this here in our chat at the moment, we are confronted with all different kinds of conspiracy theories and people, you know, entering the street, demonstrating against all these measures, which are much less brutal than the ones that you are describing at the moment in Australia. So is there any protest that one can see?
No, like, as far as I know, there was a protest, I believe, at the height of the lockdown in Melbourne, and I believe like this might have also had a number of members in the protest who were sort of preaching conspiracy theories. But as far as I'm aware, this hasn't really been too much of an issue. There was another issue that I believe perhaps does have more legal weight to it, and that was there was a protest in response very early in the lockdown in Victoria. They locked down a public housing development. So this is just as a bit of background. This is essentially like the Gemeindewohnung in Vienna, but unfortunately much less nice. And obviously occupied by people from a lower socioeconomic background, often not really speaking English particularly fluently, and such. And so this complex was immediately, without warning, surrounded by police and put into lockdown. And anyone who was, you know, people were in the car park getting bags of shopping out of their car, and they were told to leave the shopping and go back inside. And for 5 days, they were essentially put under sort of house arrest. And this obviously led to a lot of protests around this. People were bringing them food because they weren't able to get out and access medicines and get food and such. And there was actually an inquiry recently that found that this was a breach of human rights because they weren't adequately informed prior to this happening. As far as I'm aware, there hasn't actually been a case that's come before any court. Perhaps this has to do with them not having the deep pockets that the other legal challenges did, but I think this could certainly have merits.
Wow. Okay, third pillar was contact tracing that you mentioned, right? So how is this working? Is there any app in use, for example, or is it just using traditional means?
Yeah, actually, I don't really have too much information to give on this point, but yeah, I think that there is a lot of use of technology to do this. For instance, in the Australian Open, they have these barcodes that are sort of outside stadiums and in sort of gathering spots, and I believe that, I don't know whether it's actually a rule that people have to check in at these points, but essentially that's what they're for. They're for contact tracing in case there is an outbreak at the Australian Open. So yeah, as far as I'm aware, the contact tracing, especially in Victoria, was not particularly strong when the second outbreak happened, but it has picked up since. They've sort of learnt the lessons of the earlier mistakes, I guess. Yeah.
I see. And the last pillar was compliance. So people understand the rules and they support the rules and they follow the rules, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, indeed. Yes. So I don't know. I really don't know why this is sort of a particularly sort of unique point to Australia. But yes, from what's essentially has been written of the lockdowns, this was there was heavy compliance with the lockdowns, especially. Quite amazing to see sort of streets of Melbourne that were, the city of 4.5 million people just completely empty in the middle of the city, where in the middle of the day you would have absolute masses of people. It was pretty extraordinary.
So when you look with your Australian background and your experiences and your history into what's going on in Europe and in Austria in particular, what is the most bizarre or the most weird way or the most interesting phenomenon in how we deal with this here on this continent in comparison? Is there anything that really is worth being mentioned here? Something really truly different?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I can't be too harsh on
should.
I guess
You
the
should.
European. Yeah, I guess there is a fifth pillar that we haven't mentioned, which is that Australia is an island that's located at the end of the world. Essentially, is from the perspective of most people. So this has a huge benefit, which unfortunately, due to the nature, just basic geography, Europeans can't rely on. But I'd say, I think perhaps something that was a little bit striking was that there was a sort of there was kind of like an all or nothing approach to the Victorian lockdown. So they instituted a very harsh lockdown, very few exceptions, and they didn't really change the rules throughout the entire duration of the lockdown. And so I think that there was a sense of clarity that this is the rules, that that it's going to be harsh, it's going to be long, but there was like a sort of confidence and a sort of understanding of the basic rules. Whereas I think in Europe, because especially in Austria, because the rules tend to kind of they're strict, and then we kind of locked up. We opened up for Christmas, and then we went back into lockdown, and then now we're in kind of like a half state of lockdown, which is without shops being open but restaurants closed. Not really sure whether there's still a curfew, or whether exactly how many whether you're allowed to have people over for dinner and such. So I think that this sort of breeds a sort of confusion, which breeds a sort of maybe a more of a recklessness, or a sense of just antipathy for the rules, and not really having much confidence in perhaps the government to get the rules right. It's my best guess, but
I see. One of the interesting points, William, if I may switch the topic a little bit, is that Australia, of course, or Australians, of course, also need to debate about what's happening, and they need to inform themselves, etc. And they are confronted now with the situation that some of the major platforms, in particular Facebook, as far as I know, at least, are rather restrictive when it comes to access to news on their platforms because of copyright-related changes in the law in Australia. Two questions to this. First one, could you briefly give us an overview about what's really happening here? And second, does this have an impact on the COVID-related policy situation in the country at the moment? So are people upset about not getting the proper news that they need to get?
Yeah, certainly. Well, yeah, if I may start with your second point first, I think that as far as COVID goes, actually, I should mention that as of today, Facebook has actually reinstituted news on their platform because they've reached an agreement with the government. But before, there was definitely a concern that because you didn't just have news websites, but you also had public health, emergency services, charities, weather forecasters. These were all included in the sort of blackout on news. And so there was a real concern that, with the vaccines sort of coming in the next few weeks, that this would essentially lead to the spread of misinformation, conspiracy theories in the place of proper journalism, proper news. And so this was definitely a concern. But yeah, just to give like a very brief overview of this sort of dilemma. The government responding to a sort of ACCC inquiry. ACCC is the consumer commission in Australia that sort of protects consumer rights, recommended that due to the imbalance of advertising revenue between that goes to the big social platforms and traditional media, their findings were that 81% of all digital advertising funding goes to one of either Facebook or Google, and 19% is allocated for everything else. So this is traditional media, but also everything else. So it's a very small portion of what was obviously once, 15 years ago or so, a much, much bigger proportion of the advertising revenue. And so in response to that, they recommended to the government they put in place legislation that would address this sort of competitive imbalance. And currently what's being debated is this bill to essentially mandate that these Google and Facebook enter into negotiations with big media companies in Australia, big and small, to come to some agreement on distribution of money, basically to replace the diminished advertising revenues that are received. And so in response to this, Google said that they would block the search engine from operating in Australia, and Facebook said that they would block all news. Google, in the interim, entered into negotiations with a number of media companies, and Facebook followed through with its threat and blocked news. And essentially, over the last couple of days, they've hashed out a sort of a few neat technicalities that appeased Facebook enough to reinstate news. But I think that in the process, there's been quite a backlash against Facebook in Australia. A lot of people saw this as very sort of heavy-handed and on their part. But it nonetheless does give like a very interesting sort of give rise to a very interesting discussion of media ownership and such in Australia. So, for instance, there's the sort of on some levels, there's perhaps a suspicion that News Corporation, which is the big sort of Murdoch-owned media company that owns a lot of the different titles in Australia, was behind this, sort of did a lot of lobbying with the federal government in order to fast track this law and make it happen. So there is that concern, and there is also a slight concern that this will reduce media diversity. Perhaps the big companies that can do deals will do the deals, and the smaller companies will be blocked from Facebook, and obviously the smaller the company, the more reliant they might be on Facebook.
Yes.
So that's one argument, and I guess from the other sides, Facebook nonetheless has a huge influence on the news in Australia. So there is a need to rebalance that relationship.
Yeah, it's interesting because the very same debate, as you know, is happening right now in Europe and in Austria in particular because of the implementation of the digital single market copyright directive, where we have a very similar legal provision that might lead to a very similar situation here in Europe. And this agreement today that you're mentioning, do you know anything about how this really looks like? So who agreed on what today?
Yeah, certainly. So I think that it was in the form of an amendment to the bill. To be honest, it was a very the bill did not change substantially. There was sort of a bit more leeway given to the period of time in which they could negotiate these agreements, so they didn't have such a tight schedule. And I believe that a bit more leniency was given to the social media platforms. But no, it is really interesting to compare with the other countries. For instance, I was at a conference today where a Canadian professor was talking about their alternative proposal, which is currently sort of in the works. They proposed something different, which is that they would big tech giants would pay into a sort of journalism fund, essentially, so that they wouldn't have these sort of bilateral arrangements necessarily, but there would be a sort of collective fund, which is sort of like an interesting alternative. Which one works best? We'll have to wait.
Yeah, but that's something that Google was already trying, in particular in Germany, but of course on a voluntary basis, not as part of a legal obligation. So,
indeed, yeah, no, and there was actually a professor from Germany in on the conference as well, and he was discussing like what effect these deals might actually have on does the fact that Google has entered into an arrangement with News Corp in Australia for X amount of dollars, does that in essence give them a sort of media ownership in some sense, because they have this sort of financial leverage? But yeah, it's
yeah, so there is plenty of room for debate and for research in this field. Yeah. I'm quite sure about this. William, is there anything else that you want to share with us about the Australian case and how Australia is dealing with the pandemic, or did we cover everything already?
Well, not quite, no, but no. I think that was more or less it. But yeah.
Fine. So then thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this. Thank you to all our listeners and viewers. Have a good afternoon. Stay informed, stay connected with us, and in particular, stay or become healthy as quickly as possible. Thank you to all of you. Good evening. Bye.